Epistemology is the study of knowledge. How do we come to know things? How are we able to articulate what we know? And how is that knowledge mediated and contested in the process of its articulation? Now, it might seem fairly easy to do epistemology on one's own. I can just close my eyes and I can think about the things I know and the relationship between them. But the real challenge comes when we have to communicate that difference in knowledge. And oftentimes this can be difficult because a lot of modern philosophers have pointed out the extent to which our knowledge is mediated and contingent upon the language we use to express it. Certain phenomena only make sense when we can articulate them through language. They're often not directly gleaned from experience, but rather they're some sort of artifice that we come up through the complexity of our language in order to facilitate our experiences. And when it comes to these kind of concepts, there is a real problem when it comes to communicating them between different languages that are so different from one another. This is the problem of intertranslatability. And it's brought to the fore in Donald Davidson's essay on the very idea of a conceptual scheme, in which he brings up the problem of translating between different conceptual schemes. A conceptual scheme being a system by which we give form to the data of the senses. It is the way in which we take sense experience and we turn it into something coherent that can then be communicated through a series of concepts. Because this is what words are, essentially, right? It is a concept. It is some sort of signifier which signifies something that we've gleaned from experience. At least that's the kind of naive, understanding of language. But considering that the sharing of our knowledge is contingent upon the relativity within a language, it comes to be quite a difficult conversation when it comes to discussing the differences between conceptual schemes, knowing just how different my idea of some concept is from yours. Take, for example, the red of my shirt here. How do I know that the red that you're seeing is the same red that I'm seeing? Well, I can't see into your mind. The only thing we can do is talk about it. And we can use this language to talk about, for example, the way that you might react to something that's read, the way it makes you feel. But especially something like feeling is still going to be tied to the language we use to articulate that feeling. Does it make me angry? Does it make me inflamed? Does it make me impassioned? Does it make me confused? Does it make me discombobulated? All of these words that have very particular meanings if we really try to get down to it. So we have a problem of how do we talk about what seems to be the same reality. I have a perspective and you have a perspective, and we use language to hopefully mediate between these perspectives and be able to articulate some common ground. Davidson calls this common ground into question and shows that if we want to communicate, it requires what he calls a principle of charity. Now, if a conceptual scheme is used to articulate our sense experience, then it seems like there might just be some common sense data which is sent to me and sent to you when we're seeing the same thing or hearing the same thing or touching the same thing. And our conceptual schemes are just going to alter that underlying constancy of the experience. But Davidson shows that, in fact, the conceptual schemes depend on already having a knowledge of experience, which is, in fact, already informed by that language and by the cultural milieu we find ourselves in. He says, for how could something count as a language that organized only experiences, sensations, surface irritations, or sense data? Surely knives and forks, railroads and mountains, cabbages and kingdoms also need organizing. And right, all of these concepts require having some pre-familiarity with them. We have to be socialized in an environment where knives exist. such that if you try to talk about knives to an uncontacted tribe, assuming you have some linguistic similarities by which to do that, they don't have knives, so they don't know what this concept is referring to. This thing which is in your experience is predicated on you already being familiar with it. And in order for this person to be able to talk to you about that thing, they have to assume that the way in which you use your language is mostly true to the way that you experience things. This is the principle of charity, and I'll expand upon that more in a moment. But I think it's important to establish first that the way that we use language to articulate experience requires that language is organizing concepts which are themselves already language relative. So we cannot separate the conceptual scheme from the reality that is supposed to be being referred to. This is an analytic synthetic distinction that Davidson wants to collapse, and he's doing the same thing that Quine is doing. As such, he says that there is neither a fixed stock of meanings nor a theory-neutral reality which can provide ground for the comparison of conceptual schemes. Because, for example, this would imply that you have some common measure for incommensurable schemes. Say you have two languages that have concepts that are so radically distinct from one another that it cannot be articulated in the other language, at least not fully and without some sort of loss of meaning. There are all kinds of words like this in philosophy. For example, the German Geist or Dasein or aufgehoben or aufgeben or aufhebung. All of these words are kind of, different ways of talking about the same thing. You have, for example, the French word jouissance as it's used in Lacan. These are words with very particular meanings that if you want to figure out what they mean, you have to immerse yourself in the writings and the discourse of the people using the words in order to figure out how they use it. And furthermore, you have to assume that when they use those words, they're using them correctly. They're using them in the way that is actually agreed upon that it should be used. As such, we can know how to communicate with each other on the assumption that this other person is saying something true regarding their experience, just in a different way than you are. As such, this principle of charity says that we do this sort of off-the-cuff interpretation all the time. That we decide in favor of reinterpretation of a foreign concept or foreign word in order to preserve, as Davidson says, a reasonable theory of belief. He mentions, for example, we're talking about a ketch versus a yawl. Now, these are two different ways to talk about a kind of sailboat. You have a ketch on the one hand and a yawl on the other hand. And these are slightly different concepts, but I'll just read what he says. If you see a ketch sailing by and your companion says, "Look at that handsome yawl," you may be faced with a problem of interpretation. One natural possibility is that your friend has mistaken a ketch for a yawl and has formed a false belief. But if his vision is good and his line of sight favorable, it is even more plausible that he does not use the word yawl quite as you do and has made no mistake at all about the position of the jigger on the passing yacht. Right, so it's reasonable to assume that I use language slightly different from you, but provided that we're able to kind of have this common understanding that you're fairly coherent in the way you speak. I'm fairly coherent in the way I speak. And as long as I can get the general logic of what you're saying, I will use context clues in order to fill in the gaps. And the use of context clues in order to fill in the gaps between interpretations, between different translations, requires this principle of charity. It requires that I assume that you are mostly faithful to this common experience that we say we have, and that the difference can be assumed from within my own conceptual scheme. That's the real kind of nail in the coffin here, is that I can't talk about another's conceptual scheme, about another's language, except from the perspective of my own. And I can undergo different transformations with regards to my conceptual scheme such that its perspective is broadened, but I can't just have a conceptually neutral approach to reality. For example, say someone asks you to organize a closet. And this is Davidson's example. But they ask you not to organize the shoes and the shirts and the pants, but the closet itself. Davidson says, how could you do this? You would be utterly bewildered. Because in order to do some kind of differentiation and organization, it requires that you already have at your disposal a series of elements which you can organize. And these elements, which would be our concepts, are irrevocably tied to the language we use to form those concepts. And as such, the concepts that we experience in our lives. As such, Davidson says, charity is not an option, but a condition for having a workable theory. Until we have successfully established a systematic correlation of sentences held true within sentences held true, there are no mistakes to make. Charity is forced on us, whether we like it or not. If we want to understand others, we must count them right in most matters. This is the principle of charity. You assume that they're using the word correctly, and you just don't understand it, instead of assuming that they are wrong, since you can't know just how wrong they are in their conceptual scheme, since you don't know their conceptual scheme. If we can produce a theory that reconciles charity and the formal conditions for a theory, we have done all that could be done to ensure communication. Nothing more is possible and nothing more is needed. Right? For me to, for example, have a conversation with a fellow English speaker, I assume that this person probably had a reasonable education. They probably know what they're talking about. And to go on this radical skepticism that, no, they're using this word radically different than me because they use a slightly different vocabulary, for example, or they pronounce it a slightly different way, that would totally preclude the possibility of communication and translation between my desires and my needs and my beliefs at all. Now, what's important about Davidson's conclusion regarding all of this is he says, we have found no intelligible basis on which it can be said that schemes are different. That's important. I can't actually know the extent to which your idea of red is different from mine. I cannot know that, because the only way I know red is within my own conceptual scheme, which is to say, within my perception of redness. Now, we can talk about redness, and I can assume that when you say red, we're using the same word to talk about the same thing, but I can't actually know if there's a disparity at all. The only way in which I can really recognize the disparity is if there is some disparity with regards to what we do with that concept, which is where the real pragmatism of Davidson comes in, like many other pragmatists such as Quine. That I can merely use my theory in order to streamline experience. And Davidson is pointing out that these are two sides of the same coin. And by doing this, if I want to translate between two conceptual schemes, I can only do this by accepting a principle of charity on both parties' parts. So that being said, I hope that this has made sense of this important concept in pragmatist philosophy as well as modern analytic philosophy. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you just want to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, and I'd appreciate anything you have to give, but no pressure. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.